This is our next section here. We're still staying with the Mahābhārata, but now we're going to give kind of a synopsis of the Mahābhārata. We'll start off with another Gita excerpt, then we'll talk about some of the main characters, then we'll talk about pre-Pāṇḍu, and then the Kurukṣetra war a bit. This is stuff that could be done for hours, but we're going to go over it kind of quickly so that we can kind of get a sense of who the different characters are in the Mahābhārata and how they fit into the Bhagavad Gita. As we were saying before, that Bhagavad Gita is like a diamond, and the diamond is in a ring. The ring, of course, has gold in it, maybe has other jewels as well, but the diamond is the center thing. And so the Mahābhārata is this long story about the history of ancient India, including the Kuru kings coming up to the birth of Dhṛtarāṣṭra, Pāṇḍu, and Vidura, and then the birth of the Pāṇḍavas and their war with the Kauravas, and then what happened after. So this is the whole thing. But the center of Mahābhārata is Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita is the philosophy of what life is really about. So as we said that. Vedavyas wanted to make philosophy attractive for people who were not so keen on philosophy, so put it in a story form. But as we see, most of Mahābhārata doesn't just glorify bhakti. In Bhagavad Gita, in Mahābhārata, you'll see having a good family is glorified. You'll see that going to the heavenly worlds is glorified. We'll see that doing pious activity is glorified. Everything is glorified in the Mahābhārata. But in Bhagavad Gita, no. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I want you, Arjuna, to become a bhakti yogi. So he tells him about the path of karma, he tells him about the path of jnana, he tells him about the path of yoga. And he says, we've talked about all these things, but this is what I want you to be. I don't want you to be a tapasvi. I don't want you to be a jnani. I don't want you to be a karmi. I want you to be a yogi. And the kind of yogi I want you to be is a bhakti yogi. So Krishna doesn't endorse everything. He makes a very specific recipe, a recommendation in Bhagavad Gita. Then he goes on, and in chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, he explains what Bhakti Yoga is. And then from 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, in those last chapters, he talks about how jnana, or knowledge of bhakti, can increase, and how jnana leads to bhakti. So, first 6 chapters, he's getting around to explaining, I want you to do bhakti, Arjuna. He explains everything, and then he says, but this is what I want you to really do. In the middle 6 chapters, and he talks about bhakti itself, and then in the last 6 chapters, he talks about how jnana can help to make your bhakti better. So that's how Bhagavad Gita works. Okay, so we're going to go with another Bhagavad Gita excerpt. We're going to talk about the main characters, pre-Pāṇḍu, and then Kurukṣetra war. So here is our second verse. This is 245. I mentioned this verse in the last session, that Trigunya Vishaya Veda Nishtrai Gunyo Bhavarjuna Nirdvandvo Nityasattvasto Niryoga Kshem Atmavan. The Vedas mainly deal with the subject of the 3 modes of material nature. O Arjuna, become transcendental to these 3 modes. Be free from all dualities and from all anxieties for gain and safety, and be established in the self. So here, Krishna is acknowledging that the Vedas are mostly, what does it mean to be dealing with the modes of nature? It means that most of the Vedas are for people who are in the low modes, not very, very advanced, And so don't worry about them. So here Krishna says it, and I can pull it up here maybe. I can't go there unless I cancel out on the... All right, so we can't do that. At least I can't do it easily. So I'm not going to do it. So in 6 chapters we see that Krishna says, be a yogi. In the 6th chapter we see be a bhakti yogi. Then in the 8th chapter Krishna is saying that, at least I can read it from here, 8:28. Krishna says, the person who accepts the path of devotional service is not bereft of the results derived from studying the Vedas, from performing sacrifices, undergoing austerities, giving charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, one obtains all these, and at the end, he reaches the supreme eternal abode. So, that's the last verse of the 8th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And then in the 16th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, abandon all other varieties of religion. In other words, don't worry about jnana, don't worry about karma, don't worry about yajna, don't worry about tapa, just do bhakti yoga. So that's the point that I wanted to make. And here, Krishna is explaining that mostly the Vedas are about these other things. Any questions about that?
Maharaj, what is the tapa over here?
What, tapa? Well, there are many different Vedic methods or paths, we could call them, and one of them is the path of austerity. So there are Vedic austerities, like fasting, like engaging in, we heard the other day something called Chandrayana Yajna, which means that somebody goes on the full moon day and he eats a full meal. The next day when the moon gets a little smaller, he eats a little less. And then the next day when the moon is a little smaller, he eats even less, all the way down to where we get to Amavasya, where there's dark moon, then he eats nothing that day, and then the next day it starts becoming a little bit more and more and more. This is the Chandrayana Yajna. And so there are these various kinds of austerities people perform. Now in India we also see people who do these. As far as I know, there's no recipe in the Vedas for people who stand on one leg or don't speak the Mauna Vrat, or people who, there's this thing they do in Malaysia where they put hooks in the back of people's skin and they pull this chariot with it, and, there's really, by performing these intense austerities, they get either mystic powers or they get some benediction that they're looking for. And that's the path of tapa, but we don't recommend it.
So Maharaj,
they just...
Well, let me answer his question then.
So the jap yajna is also comes under the category of tapa or not?
What's
because
that?
Jap yajna, like we do jap chanting.
That's not really, well, it is an austerity, of course, but...
No, because that's all this fire sacrifice and everything, they have to chant certain mantras.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little confused whether it's part of tapa or it's part of because yajna? What exactly, how the boundary line is, whether it comes part of the
It's
power or something
actually
else?
a part of bhakti, that the process of chanting is actually directly bhakti, by, Krishna says to always think of him, Manmano bhava mad bhakto madhyaji mam namaskaru. So always think of me. And we hear in other parts of the Vedas, smartavya satatam vishnu or vishmartavya na jatu chit sarva vidi nisedyasu eteyo eva kinkara, that always remember Krishna, never forget Krishna. All the rules of the Vedas are on these two principles, always remember Krishna, never forget Krishna. So japa is the essence of always remember and never forget. And how are we always remembering? Because we're trying to hear Krishna's sound of his name. And since Krishna and his name are non-different, then that is a kind of yajna, the kind of yajna we call that is Sankirtan yajna. Yajna Sankirtanaya Prayarya Jantihi Sumedasha. So intelligent people will perform this Sankirtan yajna. So that is a type of yajna, and it's also a type of austerity. But it's actually the core, the heart of bhakti, because bhakti is about focusing on Krishna. That's what bhakti is, Whereas these other things are not about focusing on Krishna. Jnana means that we are trying to understand the mystery of the universe. We don't know it's Krishna yet, we just...
But Maharaj, meditation, how about meditation? Because in meditation we are focusing on Krishna.
Well, we may be,
Yes.
but there are many kinds of meditation.
Because sometimes when we chant, if our attention is there or not, it's may affect our chanting from qualitative point of view.
Right.
So I heard some, in some comments, I came to know that many in the scriptures or some of the spiritual leaders comment, it's mentioned that unless and until your attention is not there, and even you are chanting, then it doesn't give that much result. Even in Bhagavad Gita, it's mentioned that where your attention is, it will take you in further birth.
Right.
We have good example of Bharat Muni and all.
Right.
So basically focus is important, or if we chant also without focus, then also is okay, because I'm little trying to connect two different points. Again, as we said, that when we say Hare Krishna, especially I'm talking about chanting point of view, so here we say Lord's name and his presence is the same, like when we say Hare Krishna, so it's not just that you're chanting something, Lord is also there with the name. So Nam Rupa, so he's there. So he is there, but if we are chanting without attention or focusing on him, so focusing on Lord, so is it the same fruitful for us, or just a...
No, I mean, it's described that in the Harinam Chintamani that there are four kinds of undesirable types of chanting. One of them is Hela, which is chanting inattentively. One of them is Sanketa, where you chant but you mean something else. Like, for instance, in the Ramada Inn, the lady at the phone says, Ramada Inn. She's chanting Rama, but she's not thinking about Rama. She's thinking about the Ramada Inn. Yet she gets benefit from that. And we also have stoba, which is you chanting in a derisive or negative way, like, you Hare Krishnas, you get out of here, You're also chanting, but you're not chanting in a pleasant way. You're chanting in a negative way. And there's finally parihasya, which is chanting in a joking way, where people chant in a joking. But Hela is the one that we're concerned with, because that's the one that, and this is called namabhas, which means nearness to chanting. So namabhas means that we are chanting, but we're not fully paying attention. Yet, in the Harinam Chintamani, it mentions that namabhas will still deliver a person. However, one thing that namabhas will not give is pure devotion to the Supreme Lord. Everything else it can deliver, So that's why we have to move from namabhas to shuddhanam. And so it is an austerity to do that. It's a mental austerity, but it's actually the heart of bhakti, this idea of focusing on Krishna, because that's what bhakti is really about, focusing on Krishna. That's the center, the sort of key important feature of bhakti is this idea of focusing on Krishna through chanting. All right, so she had a question.
It was a short question. When we have to think about Krishna and remember about Krishna, and sometimes we think at the same time, but when we're chanting, like we chanting Krishna's name, and sometimes we don't remember Krishna just because we are thinking about our own issues, right? So that's why we have to think about Krishna and remember about him, especially when chanting, right? And chanting, it's like a process. We have to learn, right?
We're trying to get focused on the sound. That's the key issue. When we're chanting Hare Krishna, we're not necessarily trying to come up with images of Krishna or whatever. We're just trying to hear our own voice chanting Krishna's name without something else going on. We're not thinking about what we did yesterday. We're not thinking about what prasadam we're going to eat. We're not making some deliberation. We're not answering a question. We're not, coming up with something. We're just trying to hear, which is very hard to do. It's very hard to do. But if a person can do it, then they are making rapid progress in Krishna consciousness. The self is very, very deeply purified by the process of hearing.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, Pranam. Personally, I chant. Mostly time I chant in subway train, and little time I stay home. But when I go to the workplace, I chant my workplace, sit down or subway train. But I see I cannot control my mind. I chant here, but mind sometime go, oh, I have to cook something.
Right.
So always my mind go, then I back return, but I cannot control, but still I chant, I try my best. But if the mind go, it is sinful activities?
No, it's not sinful, but it's also not, it's namabhas, it's hela, chanting, in a kind of not very attentive way. I have to say honestly that I spent years chanting fairly unattentively, And only recently have I really tried to make a concerted, real effort to chant in a very focused way. And I began to realize things that are important that allow you to chant in a focused way. Being somewhere where there's no distraction, trying to chant in the early morning, I find that if the lights are off, it's better. There's nothing else to look at. And really praying to Krishna on the altar that please help me to control my mind. And then sometimes I start to get into almost a trance-like, Personally, I don't sit, because if I sit, I immediately go to sleep. So I always walk, and even still, by hearing the name, I can stay focused on the name, and staying focused on the name means that I am not thinking about something else, So at some point, anyone who's serious about devotional service will realize that this chanting is not just one of those things we do to please a temple commander or because somebody said something in a book. We do it because it is our basic way to get out of the material world. And if we don't focus on that, we're not going to get out of the material world, at least not very quickly. Yeah. Again.
I think that chanting, this is kind of pavement for the bhakti, just because it's just where we started, just because when this pavement is just like where we can grow strong, right?
Right.
Thank you.
Right. So, Kathy,
if Krishna asks us, recommends this, then for all souls, we know it is possible because he's him asking us, and he knows what we're capable of because he made us, and we're part and parcel for him. So it's also, AWA. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's true that we can do it, but we have to really want to do it, and we have to consistently want to do it. That's the hardest thing about chanting. It's not difficult physically. We don't have to have money to do it. We don't have to be in a special place to do it. We don't have to know some special mantra or anything like that. We don't have to watch for a particular astrological configuration. None of those things are necessary. But what is necessary is a constant bringing the attention back, which is what's a struggle, because our attention wants to go somewhere else all the time. So, at any rate, that's a kind of a whole japa segment there, which we got into as a side thing here. So let me get back on the track here, and we will... these are our main characters. I mean, some of you already know these people, but for the benefit of our YouTube audience here, we have Dhṛtarāṣṭra, who is the father of Duryodhana, and Sanjaya, he's a disciple of Vyasadeva. Roy asked about that, and I don't know more about Sanjaya than that, but I can look it up in the Puranic Encyclopedia and see if there's any more information there. Karna, he's the eldest of the Pāṇḍavas actually, but he was abandoned at birth.
He was not a Pāṇḍava. She was not married yet in that time.
Right. So in one sense, well, yeah, you're right in that sense. He was a son of Kunti, but that was before she was married to Pāṇḍu. So in one sense, he wasn't a Pāṇḍava, but then the other Pāṇḍavas weren't Pāṇḍavas either. Because they weren't directly sons of Pāṇḍu either, so in one sense that's there. But at any rate, we have that. So Pāṇḍu, he was the father of the Pāṇḍavas. We'll talk a little bit about him. Vyasadeva, of course, is the author of the Vedas. Duryodhana was the eldest of the Kurus. There were 100 sons of Dhṛtarāṣṭra and Gandhari. So, as we know, that Gandhari was pregnant, and she was hoping she would give birth before Kunti would give birth, because whoever was born first would be the next king. But Kunti gave birth first. She gave birth to Yudhishthira. So she waited, Gandhari waited, but nothing happened, and then she was angry that Vedavyasa had told her that she would have sons. And so she struck her womb and a ball of flesh came out. But Vedavyasa took the ball of flesh and he separated it and put each in a pot with ghee in it. And this is the first example of some kind of cloning process, right? And each one of those grew into a son, along with, of course, the eldest of them, which was Duryodhana. And then Gandhari had this desire to have a daughter. So they pinched off one and put another one, and this was one girl out of the whole group. So he had 100 sons and one daughter. And any rate, so that's Dronacharya. He was the military teacher for the Pāṇḍavas. Draupadi was the common wife of the Pāṇḍavas. She was a daughter of Drupad, and also Dhṛshtadyumna was Draupadi and Dhṛshtadyumna were born at the same time to Drupad, who was the king of Panchala. And then the Pāṇḍavas, of course, were the 5 main sons of Pāṇḍu, and they are Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva. In that order they were born. And of course, as we know from Kunti, Karna was born first, but nobody knew that. Even Karna didn't know that up until a certain point. And of course, Nakula and Sahadeva were not born from Kunti; they were born from Madri, but they were considered sons of Pāṇḍu anyway, even though none of them were directly biologically Pāṇḍu's sons, because there was a curse, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so moving on here. So this is a quick, a synopsis of the Mahābhārata up to the point of where Pāṇḍu gets born, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happens after Pāṇḍu is born. So Vyasadeva gets a benediction from Brahma. He wants to write the Mahābhārata, and so he asks Brahma, how will I write down these all these verses? And Brahma says, well, you can meditate, and Ganesh will write them down. So Ganesh appears, and Vyasadeva says, okay, my dear Ganesh, you will write what I speak. And Ganesh says, I will write what you speak, but I have one restriction. You can't stop speaking, because I don't want to waste time while you're thinking about something. So Vedavyasa said, okay, no problem. I will speak continually, and I won't waste your time. But if there was a time when Vedavyasa needed to speak something and he wasn't sure what he wanted to speak, he needed time to think, he told Ganesh, my dear Ganesh, you have to understand everything I say before you write it, because I don't want you to write the wrong thing. So if he wanted to slow Ganesh down, he would say something kind of not very easy to understand. And then Ganesh would have to slow down and ask questions about it. Then Vedavyasa could figure out what he was going to say next, and in that way he kept Ganesh entirely engaged throughout the entire narration of the Vedas. And particularly, this is how the Mahābhārata was written as well. So the Vaisampayana, who is a disciple of Vyasa, was the first one to narrate the Mahābhārata. And it starts off with King Vasu. King Vasu was to have he wanted to have children with his wife Girika, but just at the time where the astrological signs were correct for them to come together to have children, the demigods came and they required Vasu to perform some yajna. So instead of meeting his wife, he had to go out and do yajna. So to do the yajna, he had to collect certain things from the forest. So he went to the forest, and while he was collecting things, he was thinking about his wife. And while he was thinking about his wife, semen came from his body. And he took the semen and put it in a leaf. And he was evidently trained in falconry, so he beckoned a bird and somehow got the bird to understand where he was supposed to take the semina. And so the bird took the semina in its talons and was flying to King Vasu's wife in the palace. But on the way, another falcon saw the first falcon and thought that this must be some meat. And so they had a mid-air fight over the leaf with the semina in it. And the first falcon dropped the semina, it fell into the water, and a fish came up and ate the semina. And this fish happened to be a Apsara who had been cursed. And so she had been cursed to take the form of a fish, and she was later caught by a fisherman. And when the fisherman cut open the fish's belly, there were 2 human babies in there. Surprise, surprise. And these 2 human babies, they took to King Vasu. They were actually his children, but he didn't know it. And he kept the boy, and the girl he allowed to stay with the fisherman. And that girl was Satyavati. Well, Satyavati was a very, spiritually advanced Vaishnavi, and she was given the task of rowing people across a river by her father, who was a fisherman. So as she was rowing people across the river, one day she came and she was charged to take Parasara Muni across. And Parasara Muni was midway from one bank to the other, and he suddenly realized this is the person who should give birth to Vyasadeva. So he understood that. And he told, Satyavati, my dear Satyavati, we should couple right now and give birth to the incarnation of the Vedas. And Satyavati was shocked, as anybody would be by this. And she said, how can we do that? And we're not married, and we're in the middle of the river, there are people on both sides. And Vyasadeva said, this is not an ordinary event, that this is actually the birth of the incarnation to bring the Vedas again to the earth planet. And he created a dense fog, and they found a little island in the middle of the river, and there they came together. And it wasn't like 8 months, it was immediately that Satyavati gave birth, and she gave birth to Vyasadeva. And Vyasadeva wasn't a baby, he was already, fairly advanced, and he offered obeisances to his mother, and he said, if you ever need me for anything, call me and I will come immediately. And so Parasara said to Satyavati, my dear Satyavati, thank you for helping me into bringing the incarnation of the Vedas to the earth. Is there any benediction you want? And evidently, because, Satyavati had been born from a fish, she had a fishy smell to her body. So she said, can you do something about that? And Parasara gave her the benediction that from there on she would have natural perfume instead of a fishy smell, and her body smelled very heavenly. Even miles away you could detect that Satyavati was there. So that's, all these little pieces gradually come together and make the setting for the Bhagavad Gita to be spoken before the Battle of Kurukṣetra. We find that in the Bhagavad Gita, and this is mentioned in Bhagavatam as well, that demoniac people are being born on the earth plane. They were not actually kings or earth royalty, but they were infiltrating the royal families on the earth because they wanted to take over the earth, not because they wanted to rule the earth, but because actually they were intent on conquering the heavenly planets, because the earth is midway between where they live in the subterranean heavenly worlds and the heavenly worlds themselves. So in the subterranean heavenly worlds, although it's very opulent, actually it's even more opulent than the heavenly planets, but the controls of the universe aren't there. What the demons want to do is control the universe, and the controls for the universe are in the heavenly planets, so they want to control the heavenly planets. So they were taking birth demon by demon. And so the demigods, as we see in this picture here, they came to Brahma and said, we see this is going on, this military assembly on the earth planet, and we know what they're up to. They're going to come up here and they're going to fight us. So Brahma, what do we do? So Brahma took them to the Svetadvip, the shore of the Milk Ocean, and there they all meditated along with Brahma, and Vishnu, who is on the Ananta Sesh there, replied to Brahma in his heart that I will soon come and incarnate, and I will get rid of all these demons. So he did that. eventually Krishna would come to the earth and he would get rid of the demons. So now we go forward again. We have a very important king named Mahābhārata who had a very pious life, and he ascended to the heavenly planets. And when he got to the heavenly planets, Indra welcomed him, and he was being introduced to how things go on in the heavenly worlds. And there was an assembly of demigods. And as the assembly of demigods were coming together, Ganga Devi, who is the personification of the Ganges, she came into the assembly, and just as she came into the assembly of all the demigods, a celestial heavenly breeze blew and lifted up her dress in a way, and all the demigods, they turned their face away, but not Mahābhārata. He looked at Ganga, and he was attracted to Ganga. And Brahma was, he said, you don't do this kind of thing here in the heavenly worlds. And he said, you have to take birth now on earth again. You know, you get pushed down to the heavenly worlds. But Mahābhārata then, he studies various kings and decides he wants to become the son of King Pradīpa. So after this happens, there's another episode that occurs when there are 8 Vasus. And these Vasus were aware that Vasishtha Rishi had a very amazing cow who was a wish-fulfilling cow. And the head of the Vasus, Dyo, had his wife ask him, please give me some milk from this cow, get this cow for me. So Dyo decided with the other Vasus they would steal this cow from Vasishtha Rishi. So they did that. They stole the cow from Vasishtha Rishi. When he came back, because he's always doing yagyas, he needs cow for ghee and many other kinds of dairy products to perform his yagyas, he understood immediately the Vasus had stolen it. So he cursed them, that they would all have to go to earth. And so they found out about the curse. And they went to Vasishtha and they said, Vasishtha, can you revoke this curse, please? And he said, no. He said, but actually, I'll tell you what, since most of you were just accomplices, you will only have to spend a short time on earth. But Dyo, who was the main man who came up with this theft project, he has to spend a long time on earth. So the Vasus became very disturbed by all this, and they thought, well, if we have to go to earth, how can we make this not so bad? So they thought, well, what we can do is we'll go to Ganga Devi and we'll ask her if she'll be our mother. And so they went to Ganga Devi and they said, my dear Ganga Devi, would you agree to be our mother? And since we don't have to spend much time on earth, the minute we take birth, you can kill us. So that way we can go right back to the heavenly worlds. We don't have to spend any time on earth. So Ganga Devi agreed, and she said, well, all right, but if I'm going to be your mother, who's your father going to be? And so she found out that their father would eventually take birth as Pradīpa's son. And King Pradīpa's son would be this Mahābhārata. And Mahābhārata becomes Śantanu later on. So Ganga Devi goes to earth and she meets Pradīpa. And Pradīpa is performing some sacrifice or something like that. He's sitting down and Ganga Devi comes up and sits on his lap and says, I would like to be your wife. And Pradīpa said, my dear lady, you you are too young, and I think that you would be not good as my wife, but you would be good wife for my son. So they agree then that Ganga Devi will be the wife of Pradīpa's son. And she said, yes, I will be your son's wife, no problem. But I have one stipulation. He can never contradict or be unagreeable to anything that I do. Because she knew she was going to have to take these children and put them in the water and kill them so they could go back to the heavenly worlds. That was the agreement, And she knew that the husband wouldn't understand this. So she told this as a stipulation to Pradīpa. And he said, I'll tell my son that. So later on when Śantanu is born, he tells Śantanu, when Śantanu finally is hunting one day, he sees Ganga Devi and he wants to marry her. Pradīpa tells his son Śantanu that whatever she says, don't disagree with her, even if you can't understand why she's doing something. Of course, Pradīpa didn't know exactly what was going to happen either, And of course, then Śantanu didn't either. So Śantanu and Ganga Devi have so many children, one after another, and every time a child is born, she throws the child into the Ganga and drowns the child. And of course, this really disturbs Śantanu, as you can imagine. Why is she killing all the children? And so Śantanu, finally, the last time that they have a child, she's about to throw him into the river like she's done for all the other children. And Śantanu says, stop, I can't stand this anymore, that you're killing all the children. Who has taught you these things? Why are you doing this? And she said, oh, all right, our agreement was that if we were married, that you would never contradict anything I did or said, and since you now have, our time together is over. But I won't kill this child, and this child will be your son. But I will take him to the heavenly planets to be trained, and then he will return to you. So Ganga Devi takes the son to the heavenly worlds. He's trained. She eventually brings him back. That son becomes Devavrata. And then Devavrata is, of course, this Dio, the one that had to stay on earth for a long time. And he will become, in the future, Bhishma. So Śantanu is heartbroken that he's away from Ganga Devi now, but she's not coming back. And one day, he is also in the forest hunting, and he runs across this daughter of the fisherman, Satyavati, and he's attracted to Satyavati. But the fisherman says that if you want to marry my daughter, you cannot marry her unless her sons become the next king and not your present son, which was Devavrata. So, because the stipulation is there, Śantanu says, no deal. I won't marry her then. So he goes away. But he's a little depressed by that. And Devavrata can understand that there's something up with his father, but he doesn't know what it is. Eventually he comes to find out that the reason that Śantanu is depressed is because he can't marry Satyavati, because he's not willing to give up giving the throne to Devavrata. So Devavrata realizes that it's him that's standing between his father being able to marry Satyavati. So Devavrata goes to the fisherman and he says, my father said no deal to this idea that Satyavati would become, her children would become the next king on my sake. But I am taking a vow that I will not become king, that her children can become the king. So he takes a vow to abdicate the throne. And so the fisherman says, well, my dear Devavrata, but what about your children? They may claim to be the throne. And so Devavrata says, therefore I claim I will not have any children I will never marry. So this is, for a Kshatriya, something that's unheard of. Many Kshatriyas have...
His whole life is brahmachari.
Right. So he never marries. And for a Kshatriya, that's very unusual. Kshatriyas have sometimes many, many wives. But in this case, he didn't have any. He had 0 wives. He took a vow of celibacy. And so his name was Bhishma, which means great vow. So this Devarata becomes Bhishma. And later on, from Satyavati are born 2 children, Citrāṅgada and Vicitravīrya. So Citrāṅgada and Vicitravīrya are born from Śantanu and Satyavati. Citrāṅgada is killed in a battle with a Gandharva who has the same name. It kind of reminds me of one of those Wild West movies where there's not room enough in this town for 2 Citrāṅgadas. So evidently the Citrāṅgada from the heavenly worlds had the same name as the king Citrāṅgada, and he challenged the earthly Citrāṅgada to a fight, and of course the heavenly demigod Citrāṅgada won, and the earthly Citrāṅgada was killed in the battle. So then Vicitravīrya was too young to have the throne. So what Bhishma Dev did is he decided to find wives for Vicitravīrya. So he kidnapped the queens of Kashi. So there was a Swayamvara. The queens of Kashi were choosing their husband, but Bhishma just swooped in unannounced and took all 3 queens. And everybody was surprised. I thought this was the guy that wasn't going to have any wives, and they said, and they're young girls, and he's really old. This is not right, So they fought, but of course Bhishma was Bhishma, so they couldn't do anything. And he brought the 3 queens of Kashi, Amba, Ambalika, and Ambika, to be queens and have the children of Vicitravīrya. However, Vicitravīrya died of tuberculosis, so he never had a chance to meet his wives. One of the wives, Amba, she approached Bhishma and said, actually, I had wanted to marry Shalva, and you have my other 2 sisters. Do I also have to marry Vicitravīrya? Can't I go to Shalva? And Bhishma thought about it for a while and said, well, it sounds reasonable to me. You can go and marry Shalva. When she went to Shalva, Shalva rejected her because she'd already been touched by Bhishma. So he said, well, you can marry Bhishma if you want, but you're not marrying me. So she went back and said, well, now Bhishma, you have to marry. He said, wait a minute, I wasn't going to marry you. I got you and your sisters for Vicitravīrya. And of course, Amba becomes very angry by this because she feels that her life has been ruined by this capturing of Bhishma Dev, and so she takes a vow that she wants to kill Bhishma. Well, first of all, she tries to get Bhishma to marry her, but that doesn't work out. And then she decides to take a vow that she will be the cause of Bhishma's death. So she wants to take birth as a man in the future life so that she can be the cause of Bhishma's death. And that, of course, will happen. She will eventually become Sikandi. All right, so now Vicitravīrya is dead. We have these 2 queens that are left, Ambika and Ambalika, and no king. So what do we do now? So that's where, we have this question of what will we do now? So Satyavati says that you, Bhishma, have to give us children because otherwise we've got no one in the line. Bhishma says, no. I took a vow I wasn't going to marry. So then they come up with the idea that there's someone else in the family because, as we said, Satyavati was the mother of Vedavyas. So Satyavati says, but Vedavyas can be the father. He's also in the same line. Nobody knew the fact that she was the mother of Vedavyas because it happened under such strange circumstances. So she calls for Vedavyas, and Vedavyas immediately comes, and he says, she tells him, my dear son, can you continue our line of kings? We have these two queens, Ambika and Ambalika, and they can be the queens that give us birth to kings that will continue our kingly line. So Vedavyas said, well, first they have to become very purified. They have to undergo very many purifying ceremonies. This will take some months. And Satyavati says, we don't have time for that. You know, at any time the kingdom could get attacked. A kingdom with no king is a very dangerous situation. So she said, we have to do it right away. So Vedavyas said, all right. And so it's arranged that Vedavyas will come to the bedroom of each of these queens, and the queens don't know who it is that's going to give them children. They imagine, because it's someone in the family, that it's going to be some kshatriya that they're going to meet. They don't know it's Vedavyas. Of course, Vedavyas is a yogi. He's not a kshatriya. He lives in the forest, and he has matted hair, and he looks very strange. He's emaciated. Not exactly the romantic type, you know. So when the first queen sees Vedavyas in the bedchamber, she is so terrified that she closes her eyes. And of course, when Vedavyas comes together with her and he comes out of the bedchamber, then Satyavati asks, well, what will happen now? And he says, well, because the queen closed her eyes when we came together, therefore this child will be blind. And of course, that child will become Dhṛtarāṣṭra. Blind, right. So Satyavati said, well, that's no good. A king that's blind can't really be a king. He can't protect the kingdom. So we have to do this again. So this time, the other queen gets set up with Vedavyas. And when she sees Vedavyas, she turns white with fear. And so when Vedavyas comes from the bedchamber, Satyavati asks again, well, what about this child? And Vedavyas said, because the queen turned white with fear upon seeing me in my, yogis not only looked gnarly, but they also sometimes had kind of a funny odor to them and everything. So it was, not exactly what a queen would expect, So he said, therefore, this child will be very, very white. And then Satyavati said, well, we should do this at least one more time. So she arranged that Vedavyas would meet one of the two queens, and neither of them could go through it again with Vedavyas. So instead, they asked one of their maidservants to substitute. Now, when the maidservant was in the bedchamber and Vedavyas came, she understood he was a great sage, and she treated him very respectfully. And when they came together, when Vedavyas came from the bedchamber the third time, that Satyavati said, well, what about this child? And he said, well, the two queens have substituted one of their maidservants, and therefore this child will be very spiritual. However, he will not be part of the royal family. So that was Vidura. So we have now Dhṛtarāṣṭra, Pāṇḍu, and Vidura, born from these two queens and one of their maidservants. And then the last bit here is the birth of Karna. So evidently, Kunti Devi, as a young girl, was one day working, serving various people who came, and one of those people who came was Durvas Muni, who was a very easy to rile up sage. And people were really terrified of Durvas Muni, because if you cross him, do something wrong, you're liable to get cursed, So what happened then was she was very careful, and she treated him very nicely, Durvas Muni, and served him prasadam in the way he really liked. And so he decided to give her a benediction. and he gave her a mantra. And the mantra was that whenever she uttered the mantra, a demigod of her choosing would come to her. That was the mantra that Durvas Muni gave to Kunti Devi. He didn't tell her why he gave her this mantra, because he knew in the future that Kunti would marry Pāṇḍu, and Pāṇḍu would not be able to have children. He gave her that mantra so that she could have children by demigods. But she didn't know that. He didn't want to disturb her mind because she was a young girl at the time. And he told her that this mantra would work, but he didn't tell her why he'd given her the mantra. So one day, she thought, hey, let's just check this mantra out, let's see what happens. So she chanted the mantra, and the sun god appeared. She called to the sun.
Karna is the son of sun.
Sun god, right. Surya.
Son of sun.
Yeah, son of the sun.
Son of sun.
Right. So
we call Suryaputra, right?
Right. So suddenly, the sun god appears to Kunti Devi, and the sun god says, "Oh, I'm here to give you a child." She said, "Whoa, I didn't know that was part of the deal." She didn't realize that he had actually been there to give her a child. And she said, "Well, I'm just a young girl and I'm unmarried, and we can't do this." And Surya, the sun god, said, "Well, you don't have to worry. The child will be born from your ear instead, and you will retain your virginity. And this way that you will keep the contract of the mantra." And so, of course, they came together, and Karna was born from the ear of Kunti Devi. So that's why he's named Karna, because Karna means ear. Now, Kunti didn't know what to do. She was a young girl, she was unmarried, he was a baby. And so she did what we see in the Bible, like Moses, where she put the child in a basket and put the child, floated on the river, and she never found out what happened to the child, at least in the immediate time. The basket floated down, and it was found by one Adversaries and his wife, and they adopted this child, who was actually the first child of Kunti Devi. All right, so that's pre-Pāṇḍu. Any questions about any of that whole segment? There's a lot of stuff there.
How about the brother of Vasu?
What's that?
Sorry. Well, how about the brother of Satyavati?
The brother of Satyavati. He became he was kept by Vasu, but I don't know, it doesn't mention exactly what happened to him, Was he a king or administrator, or what did he do? Okay. Any other questions about this? Okay, so this is, I just wanted this to be there for people who are watching, and also for you all, so that you get a kind of sense of how the Mahābhārata leads up to the birth of the Pāṇḍavas. And right now we've talked about the birth of Dhṛtarāṣṭra, Pāṇḍu, and Vidura, and we've talked about the birth of Karna, but we haven't talked about the birth of the Pāṇḍavas. So we will what is happening? There we go. So now here is after the birth of Pāṇḍu. So we have Pāṇḍu marrying Kunti and Madri. So Pāṇḍu is chosen by Kunti at her Swayamvara, and they're married. And later on, Pāṇḍu marries also Madri. Pāṇḍu was not a stay-at-home king. He was a kind of person who liked to be out in his kingdom. And so instead of living in the palace, they were constantly living in the forest. And in the forest, Pāṇḍu sometimes hunted, but mostly he paid a lot of attention to sages, and he learned a lot about the Vedic literature because he wanted to get instructions from these sages. So that's what Pāṇḍu did mostly in the forest. And eventually, when the Pāṇḍavas grew up, they also spent a lot of time with the sages. So they did not grow up in the court at Hastinapur. They grew up in the forest. So after Pāṇḍu had married Kunti, Dhṛtarāṣṭra married Gandhari. So Gandhari learned that she would be pledged to marriage with Dhṛtarāṣṭra, and she learned that her future husband would be blind. So Gandhari took a vow that she put a scarf around her eyes so she would also not see. If her husband couldn't see, she wouldn't see either. And because of this austerity that Gandhari underwent, she had mystic power. So she was a very powerful person. And both Dhṛtarāṣṭra and Gandhari and Pāṇḍu and Kunti were wanting to have a child, because whoever would give birth first, according to the law of primogeniture, then that would be the king, the next king. Now, Pāṇḍu had been cursed. One time Pāṇḍu had been hunting in the forest, and he saw a deer sporting with its mate, and Pāṇḍavas shot the deers, with his arrows. And he was surprised that the deer spoke to him in a human voice, because in fact they weren't deers. They were actually sages who lived in the forest, and this sage was coming together with his wife. And they were doing it in a deer form for some reason or another, And the deer cursed him, that just as he had been killed during the time of procreation with his wife, that should Pāṇḍu come together with his wife, the same thing would happen to Pāṇḍu. So Pāṇḍava knew this curse. Pāṇḍu knew this curse. He knew that this curse meant that he would never be able to have children in the usual way. Therefore, this was a question, but now for the first time, Kunti understands why Durvasa Muni had given her this particular benediction that she could call any demigod that she wanted. Evidently this was for her to have children, because her husband wasn't able to do that. So she calls, of course, the Yamaraj, which is the first demigod that she calls. And Yamaraj is she wanted a son. They both wanted a son that was very, very dedicated to religion. So Yamaraj was the likely father. And Yamaraj begat, of course, Yudhishthira. Then Pāṇḍu asks her to do it again, and this time they call the wind god, and the wind god is Vayu, so that becomes Arjuna. Bhima, I'm sorry, not Arjuna, but Bhima. So Bhima is the son of the wind god. Now, the third time they get the demigod, who was her? Indra, right, Indra. So Indra is the father of Arjuna. Now, Madri is saying, okay, that works for you, Kunti, but can you teach me this mantra? So Pāṇḍu asks Kunti to teach Madri the same mantra. And of course, Madri calls the twin Ashvini Kumara demigod, so she gets two children. And that bothers Kunti because she got a 2-for-1 deal, and so this is, of course, Nakula and Sahadev. So now you have the 5 Pāṇḍavas. And since Yudhishthira was born first, it eclipsed any children being born from Dhṛtarāṣṭra and Gandhari as being the heir apparent for the kingdom. So this didn't sit very well with Dhṛtarāṣṭra, and it certainly didn't sit well with Gandhari. And that's when she struck her womb and the ball of flesh came out, and that's when Vyasadeva put all the children in pots and they all came up. So that's how Gandhari and Dhṛtarāṣṭra had 100 sons and 1 daughter. So as the children were growing up, you had the Pāṇḍavas mostly in the forest, and you had the Kauravas, who were the 100 sons of Gandhari and Dhṛtarāṣṭra, in the in the palace at Hastinapur. And when Pāṇḍu one day was overtaken with desire for his wife Madri, he tried to approach her, and she knew that if he approached her, he would die. But she couldn't fight him off, and so Pāṇḍu died. And so therefore, once Pāṇḍu was dead, the idea was to go back to Hastinapur. But Madri said, there's no reason for both of us to go back to Hastinapur. Our mutual husband, Pāṇḍu, wanted to enjoy, so let me enter his funeral pyre. They were both going to enter the funeral pyre, but Madri said, no, one of us has to stay behind to raise the children because, so Kunti decides to be the one to stay behind, and Madri enters the funeral pyre. And so Pāṇḍavas gone, and Kunti and the 5 Pāṇḍavas go back to Hastinapur for the first time because they really had not spent any time in Hastinapur. And once they're there, they realize that the Kauravas, Duryodhana and all of his sons, they've been there the whole time. They've got everything all figured out. They've been running things and doing things. And the Pāṇḍavas are kind of like new kids on the block. They just came out of the forest. So this is why Duryodhana is not at all interested in sharing the throne with the Pāṇḍavas, and right away he thinks about how to kill the Pāṇḍavas. So he tries to poison Bhima. Later on, he tries to burn them in a house of lac. So he does these various assassination attempts, and they fail. As the Pāṇḍavas and the Kauravas are growing up, they come in contact with Dronacharya, and Dronacharya agrees to be their martial teacher, their teacher of how to engage in battle. So Dronacharya teaches both the Pāṇḍavas and the Kauravas how to be good warriors. And then there's a big display of their military ability. They have a big stadium erected, and so both the Pāṇḍavas and the Kauravas, they're riding on horses, shooting arrows, fighting with clubs, jumping off things, showing various kinds of military skill. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this mysterious Karna appears. Now, Karna had grown up with Adirat and his wife, who were kind of low in the scheme of things. They weren't very important. Adirat was a chariot manager. He drove a chariot and he did things like work with horses and things like that. And Karna wanted to learn military skill, even though he didn't think he was a kshatriya. He actually was a kshatriya, that's why he had that motivation, but he didn't know that he was. So there's a whole story of how Karna eventually managed to learn military skill from Parasuram. But anyway, I won't get into that because that takes us too far aside. But Karna comes into this military display, and challenges Arjuna. He said, this Arjuna seems to have won everybody's heart by what he does, but he's doing a lot of things that are very insignificant compared to what I can do. So Arjuna was naturally, immediately, disturbed by that. Karna had just challenged him. And then the Pāṇḍavas asked, well, who are you? Whose son are you? Because this is for royalty. What royal line do you come from? Of course, Karna began immediately to look downward in shame because he wasn't really supposed to be there. However, Duryodhana noticed, and he thought, this man doesn't like the Pāṇḍavas, and I don't like the Pāṇḍavas. This man is my friend. So he immediately made Karna the king of the Angas. So he said, well, now he's royalty, because it was within Duryodhana's power to do that, so he did that. And then they start to fight with one another. And of course, Kunti's watching this, and she knows this has to be the child that I put in the basket, so she recognizes Karna. And she knows that if Karna and Arjuna fight, one of her two children is going to die. So, at any rate. And then later on, they don't actually get to the point the day ends, and they don't really fight with one another. But Drona asks his students for some kind of dakshin for having taught them. So he asks them to conquer Drupad. So they do that. The Pāṇḍavas and the Kauravas, they go and they attack Drupad. There's a whole story of why Drupad and Dronacharya were on bad terms with one another. But the Pāṇḍavas conquer Drupad, so Drupad then becomes conquered by Arjuna and the Pāṇḍavas. And then eventually Drupad is angered by the fact that he has to share his kingdom with Dronacharya. So he wants to have a sacrifice for someone who will kill Dronacharya. And this does happen. And in this sacrifice, for a son that will kill Dronacharya, comes Dhristadyumna and Draupadi. So Draupadi eventually winds up marrying, she's won in a special match by Arjuna. The Pāṇḍavas are in hiding after the attempt to burn them, so they are in disguise. And while in disguise, they find out about Draupadi being marriageable, and that the Drupad has this challenge that anyone can shoot an arrow into an eye of a fish through a rotating wheel, looking at agitated water that's only reflecting. So it's an incredibly difficult task to do. But Arjuna manages to do that, and he wins the hand of Draupadi. So Arjuna and Draupadi are coming back to where they had been staying in the forest in seclusion, and the Pāṇḍavas say, guess what Arjuna won in a contest at the kingdom of Drupad? And Kunti says, well, whatever he won, he should share it with his brothers. And so when they get there, they said, my dear mother, Kunti, you didn't realize what Arjuna won was a wife. How can he share that with his brothers? And then Kunti becomes disturbed. She thinks, I don't know how this could possibly go on. But Vedavyasa arrives. And Vedavyasa said that this is actually the way it will be, that Draupadi will be the common wife of all 5 Pāṇḍavas. They had other wives as well, but she will be the common wife of all 5 Pāṇḍavas, which was not something that was done at that time, but because there's a whole story behind why that too. But this is why the Mahābhārata's 100,000 verses long, because all these things have stories and side stories. But at any rate, so the Pāṇḍavas return after winning Draupadi. They come out of hiding, and Dhṛtarāṣṭra decides to give them a useless piece of land that's mostly a desert called Pāṇḍava. And so they go there, but Arjuna and Krishna decide to revamp Pāṇḍava. And there are many very many demoniac entities living there. Most of them aren't in human form. And Pāṇḍava is eaten by the fire god Agni, so it's burning. And after that happens, then they create a city there, and eventually that city becomes very, very important and very powerful. Lots of people move there, and it becomes called not Pāṇḍava but Indraprastha. And this, of course, makes Duryodhana green with envy. And he decides that he wants to conquer the Pandavas by a gambling match. So he gets together with his uncle Shakuni, and there's some crooked dice, and he wins away everything the Pandavas own. And eventually he even wins Draupadi, because he asks, after he's actually won the Pāṇḍavas themselves as his slaves, he says, well, you still have one thing left, you can wager your wife, Draupadi. So he again wins, and so they drag Draupadi into the gambling arena, and Dushasana, who is brother of Duryodhana, tries to strip Draupadi naked. But however, as he tries to unroll her sari, Krishna supplies a limitless sari, and it just goes on, and he can never get to the point where she's disrobed. But the Pandavas never forget that their wife was insulted in such a way. After this, Draupadi appeals to the whole assembly that, is there no virtue here in this assembly at all? And Dhṛtarāṣṭra has a change of heart at that moment. And he says, yes, my dear Draupadi, I give your husbands back everything. So this mortified his son, Duryodhana, because Duryodhana was so happy that he'd come to the point where he'd finished the Pandavas. He took everything away from them. He took away their wife. They were supposed to be his slaves now. And here was his father reneging on the whole deal, nullifying the entire gambling match. So what happened then was that Dhṛtarāṣṭra, not Dhṛtarāṣṭra, but Duryodhana challenged him to one more gambling match. And this one was that whoever won would continue to be king, and whoever lost had to go to the forest for 13 years. So that's how the Pandavas had to be exiled to the forest. So they went to the forest for 13 years. So the assumption was that as a result, or the stipulation of the gambling match was, after they came back from the forest, that the Pandavas would get at least their previous kingdom back, But of course that would not happen, and that's what sets things up for the Battle of Kurukṣetra. So this is how we come to the point where once the Pāṇḍavas spend their 13 years in the forest and they come back, that they expect their kingdom back, but Duryodhana's not having it. He's not going to give them back. Many different negotiation attempts were done to try to broker some peace, some conclusion, and none of those worked. And therefore, the Battle of Kurukṣetra had to happen. And now we're ready for the Bhagavad Gita. So, questions about any of that? Okay, so that was my Cliff Notes version of the Mahābhārata. Okay, so this is what we're going to do next week. Is we'll talk about various different divisions of Hinduism, then we'll talk about interpretations in Western philosophy. So again, if you want, we have a quick test. I'll put that one on.